Hey everybody, happy Thanksgiving. Hope you're enjoying the holiday. This year I decided to do a typical YouTuber thing, and I made an anthology video for the holiday. This video accomplishes two things. First of all, it takes some workload off of me during the holidays, so I can actually enjoy the holidays. And second of all, it provides you, the viewer, with a nice long video to watch. So for example, you can play it in the background while you're cooking Thanksgiving dinner, or maybe the in-laws are visiting and you're hiding from them and you need something to watch. I'm not gonna judge. But anyway, this video is a complete anthology of the suspension build in my BMW E46, aka the basket case BMW. So now you can get all the suspension build information all in one video. Okay, now that we have all the pleasantries out of the way, let's get into the build. Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you all the parts that are going to be used in the BMW suspension rebuild. I'm also going to explain the thought process behind selecting those parts. Anyway, let's get started. Okay, here we have all the suspension parts laid out. The front suspension on the E46 is pretty simple, so let's start there. Alright, for starters we have the coilovers from BC Racing. The springs are 6K, or 6 kilograms per millimeter. They came with sway bar end links, which is pretty cool because the sway bar didn't come with any. Speaking of the sway bar, this is a 30 millimeter bar from Whiteline. Here we see the sway bar mounting bushings. Also, I bought some reinforcement plates for the sway bar mounting point, just in case, because this bar is pretty stiff, and I don't want it pulling the mounting studs out of the chassis. We also have reinforcing plates for the strut towers. These are OEM BMW parts. And last but not least, we have urethane control arm bushings. These, if I remember correctly, they are 95A stiffness. I bought these instead of something like Delrin or monoballs, simply because these were on sale, and they should do the job. Moving on to the rear suspension, we have springs and dampers once again from BC Racing. These springs are 12K, or 12 kilograms per millimeter. We also have another sway bar from Whiteline. This one I believe is 20 millimeter. This sway bar came with bushings and end links. We also have reinforcing plates for the rear subframe. These obviously are from Turner Racing. Speaking of the subframe, here are the bushings for it. These are solid Delrin, and these guys are pretty stiff. These came from Garagistic. These were also on sale. Okay, moving on. We have some polyurethane control arm bushings. These are from PowerFlex. I don't remember the stiffness on these, sorry. I bought these instead of monoballs, simply because the monoballs cost like 3 times as much, and I'm not sure if that juice is worth the squeeze. Also, we have adjustable lower camber arms. I also bought some rear trailing arm bushings from a Toyota Camry. These are monoball bushings, and from what I've told, these are fairly easy to install. Speaking of monoball bushings, these are the outer control arm bushings. These are actually stock replacements, which are monoballs already, so that's pretty cool. Moving on to the rear differential, we have urethane differential bushings. These, if I remember correctly, are 80A stiffness. We have a rear differential cover with cooling fins in it for, well, obviously better cooling of the differential. And last but not least, we have new seals for the differential. Okay, so you may be wondering why I'm using relatively soft urethane bushings for the differential instead of going for something stiffer like, I don't know, aluminum or UHMW or whatever. The reason for that is I want the bushings to have at least some give to them to absorb vibration. And that's not necessarily because of differential noise per se, but rather I don't want chassis vibration getting transmitted into the differential. I'm going to be pushing this differential pretty hard, and I want to give it every chance it can get. So if we're not dumping excess vibration into it from the chassis, maybe that will help it live longer. Okay, moving on to the subframe bushings. I chose these solid Delrin bushings because I want the rear subframe to be mounted as solidly to the chassis as possible. You see, the rear suspension is attached to the subframe, so if the subframe moves around, the suspension moves around with it, and that's going to negatively affect the alignment. I don't want that. Okay, the rear subframe reinforcements are pretty self-explanatory. Cracking at the subframe mounting points is a common problem with the E46 BMWs, so hopefully this kit will help with that. And speaking of chassis issues, these reinforcement plates, like I mentioned earlier, are to reinforce the front strut towers. This is also an E46 BMW common issue. As a matter of fact, the driver's side strut tower on my car is already mushroomed out. So I'm going to have to flatten that guy out before I install these. Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about the spring and sway bar setup. Like I mentioned in the previous video, the BC Racing coilovers normally come with 8K front springs and 12K rear. But I decided to go with 6K front springs and 12K rear. The reason for that is, well, there are two reasons. First of all, my car is about 500 pounds lighter than stock. Since my car is so much lighter than stock, it can use softer spring rates. So at this point, you're probably wondering why I didn't go with a softer rear spring as well. The reason for that is I want to use a suspension setup called flat ride. Basically what you do is you make the rear suspension stiffer than the front, and that will help the suspension recover after you go over a bump. Now, of course, that's going to make the rear suspension more oversteery, so to compensate for that, you use a stiffer front sway bar. And that's why I'm using a 30mm front bar and a 20mm rear. The front bar is significantly bigger than the stock one, whereas the rear bar is only slightly bigger than the stock one. So hopefully that will balance out the oversteer from the stiffer rear springs. Anyway, that basically covers the whole suspension setup that I'm using for the BMW. In the next video, we're going to start installing these parts, so stay tuned. Hey folks, the BMW is up on jack stands and the front wheels are coming off. If you saw the two previous videos, you know the basket case BMW is about to get a complete suspension overhaul. So let's get started. Before I start working on the suspension, I want to measure the ride height at each wheel. I'm going to measure from the center of the wheel to the top of the wheel well arch. This will give me a frame of reference for the new suspension. Okay, we got our measurements. Now it's time to go to work. I decided to start with the front suspension. The front suspension on the E46 BMW is pretty simple, so it should be a piece of cake, right? Anyway, let's get the car up on jack stands and start tearing apart the front suspension. I put the wheels under the car for a bit of extra safety, so if the jack stands fail, I won't be completely squished. Check it out, the wasps are making nests in my wheels. Sometimes I swear this place is like Dagobah. First order of business is to remove the splash shield under the engine. My car is an older model with the triangle brace, and it blocks access to the front control arm bushings, so that brace needs to come out. It has 4 bolts. With the brace out of the way, we can access the control arm bushings, so let's do that next. Each bushing has 2 bolts. After the bolts are removed, I had to pry it loose from the chassis with a piece of pipe. To remove the bushing from the control arm, I first tried tapping it off with a hammer, but that didn't work. So I doused it with penetrating oil and wrangled it loose by hand. I did it this way because I didn't want to remove the control arms from the car. Here we have the new control arm bushings sitting next to the old ones for comparison. I marked the front face on the bracket with the letter F so I would know which way to install the new bushings. Okay, let's move on to the sway bar. This is pretty straightforward. I'm going to detach the end links first. You can counter hold the end link with a 16mm wrench and remove the nut with a 16mm socket. Simple enough. Next, we'll remove the 2 mounting brackets. Each bracket has 2 13mm nuts. And that's it. The sway bar is out. And I'm about to break my light. So far, things are going great. All I have left to do is remove the struts. First, we need to unclip the brake hoses and the wiring from this bracket on the strut. Then we're going to remove the pinch bolt that holds the bottom of the strut in place. Now we can push down on the steering knuckle and it'll slide off the bottom of the strut. Luckily, the brake line was just long enough to let that happen. Next, we remove the 3 nuts on top of the strut tower and the strut comes out. But before we do that, let's talk about those strut towers. On the E46 BMW, it's common for the strut towers to become deformed. So I'm going to check that. On the right side, the strut tower seems to be okay. The top of the strut tower seems to be pretty flat. But the left side is a different story. The top of the strut tower is bulged out. This is also known as mushrooming. And you can see how the mounting bolts are sticking out at odd angles. Basically, the whole strut assembly has been pushed up into the strut tower, causing the top to bulge out. Looking back at the ride height measurements, we can see the left front corner is sitting a little bit low, and the right rear is sitting a little high. I'm willing to bet this is because of the damaged strut tower. Since the strut is pushed up into the chassis, that means the chassis will sit lower in relation to the suspension. And if the front corner sits lower, it's going to pull the opposite corner up. Anyway, we'll find out soon enough. Let's get back to the strut removal. The bottom of the strut is already out, so at this point we just need to remove the 3 nuts on top. This one needed some persuasion to come out because those bolts on top were bent. And this is where things started going wrong. When I tried to remove the strut on the right side, the suspension wouldn't move down far enough to let the strut come loose. So I thought, okay, I'll detach the ball joint from the steering knuckle and drop the knuckle out of the way. But that ball joint wouldn't cooperate. I tried several different methods, but nothing worked. So then I tried the inboard ball joint. Same story. I also tried using spring compressors to shorten the strut so it could come out, but they wouldn't fit in the strut tower. After beating my head against the wall for several hours, I decided to drop the subframe. To do that, I needed to install an engine support fixture, detach the motor mounts, and all that jazz. At this point, operating the camera was the last thing on my mind, so we just have a few photos. I used the floor jack to lower the subframe about an inch or two, and that was enough. So finally, we have the old suspension parts removed. This project took twice as long as it should have because of the trouble removing that one strut. It tried my patience, but I persevered. By the way, here's the old sway bar compared to the new one. Notice any difference? I could make a joke about girth, but I'm too tired right now. I also took this opportunity to power wash the undercarriage. This is a perfect time to clean out the wheel wells and the strut towers as well. Now we have a bunch of new suspension parts ready to install. But unfortunately, we've run out of time for this video, so we'll have to do that in the next video. Stay tuned! Now I need to address an issue with the steering. The steering is pretty loose and the car likes to wander down the road. It feels pretty sketchy. So I got under the car and checked to see what was loose. If you look closely at this video clip, you can see two things. The steering coupler has some play in it, plus there's some play in the steering rack. So I ordered a steering coupler and decided to adjust the preload on the rack to take out the slack. The preload adjustment is pretty straightforward, but it's in a tight spot. There are some pipes in the way of the adjuster, so they need to be moved. This bracket on the side of the oil pan holds those pipes, so let's remove it. To adjust the preload, we need to loosen the set screw a little bit. We only need to loosen it maybe half a turn or so, just to take the tension off the adjuster. The adjuster is on the top of the rack. I had to push those lines out of the way to get my wrench in there. Now don't go crazy with the adjuster. It should only be tightened enough to take out the slack in the steering rack. If you tighten it too much, the steering rack will start to bind up and it'll be hard to turn the steering wheel. If that happens, just loosen the adjuster a little bit. Ideally, you want the steering wheel to turn freely and also no slack. It might take some trial and error to get there, so be patient with it. Once it's in the right spot, tighten the set screw and you're done. Okay, so I got the slack out of the rack, but that steering coupler needs to be dealt with. I decided to try a urethane steering coupler sold by Ireland Engineering Motorsport. I've never done business with them before. I found them in a Google search. So this is kind of an experiment. Anyway, they sell just the disc. So your original steering coupler needs to be disassembled and the disc needs to be installed in it. Removing the steering coupler wasn't too hard, but space is tight in there. There wasn't enough room to get the tools and the camera in there at the same time, so I took a couple photos instead. But there's one bolt on either end of the coupler. They're inverted Torx bolts. You may need to turn the steering wheel a little bit to get access to the bolts. I also had to loosen the steering rack and move it forward a little bit. The rack has two bolts that attach it to the cross member. You'll need to hold the nut on top of the bolt with a wrench. Then you can remove the coupler from the rack. Oh, and here's another look at how loose the steering coupler was. It's pretty bad. Before disassembling the coupler, I put alignment marks on it with a Sharpie marker. I want to be sure I put it back together correctly. Disassembly involves removing those big rivets that hold everything together. You can drill or grind the ends off the rivets, just be careful not to damage the aluminum underneath. The method I used was to drill out most of the rivet head, then finish it off with a chisel. But I think an angle grinder might have been faster. Anyway, here's the disassembled steering coupler. Now we need to reassemble it with the urethane disc and the supplied bolts. The coupler has two sets of bolt holes, one for the E46 and one for the E30. The website says it comes with the metal sleeves installed in the E30 holes, but on mine the sleeves were installed in the E46 holes. Also, I learned the hard way that the bolts need to be installed a certain way. The urethane coupler doesn't come with instructions, so I had to figure it out myself. Of course, I got it wrong the first try. But the head of the bolt needs to be on the side that has the slot in it. If you get it backwards, the end of the bolt will protrude too far and prevent the coupler from seating correctly. Last but not least, here's a shot of the coupler installed. I took the car for a test drive and was pretty impressed. There's no slack in the steering, and the steering response is immediate. I like it. That's it for this video. See you next time. Before we start installing those new parts, we first need to address the strut towers. Let me show you what I'm talking about. First, let's take a look at the right side. I'll take one of the strut tower reinforcement plates and test fit it inside the strut tower. You can see the plate fits nicely. It's almost perfectly flush with the top of the strut tower. This is how it's supposed to fit. But with the left strut tower, the story is different. When I test fitted the reinforcing plate into this one, there was a noticeable gap. That's because the top of the strut tower is deformed, also known as mushrooming. Before we install the front struts and the reinforcing plates, we need to fix the mushrooming. The method I used to fix it is surprisingly simple. I just beat on it with a mallet. But I didn't want it to look like I beat on it with a mallet, so I used a block of wood to protect the sheet metal. I placed the block of wood on the strut tower and beat on the wood instead. Every so often, I would stop beating on it to test fit the reinforcing plate. After beating on it for a while, I finally got a good fit. After all that whacking, I still had energy left over to install the struts. However, before installing them, I first need to set the ride height. On these coilover struts, the spring preload and the ride height are adjusted separately. The instructions say the preload is already set, so I'm not going to mess with it. But I will adjust the ride height. You adjust it by moving the bottom piece higher or lower on the strut. If you move it up, that makes the strut shorter and reduces the ride height. If you move it down, that lengthens the strut and increases ride height. The instructions also say at least 80 millimeters of the strut body needs to be threaded into the bottom piece. I measured 80 millimeters up from the bottom of the strut body and marked it with a Sharpie. This is basically the maximum ride height because moving the bottom piece further down will be unsafe. I decided to leave the struts at that setting, and if they need to be adjusted in the future, I can do that. I also noticed the struts are marked left and right. So for example, this one is marked FR for front right. You may have also noticed the bottom part of the strut has these little round tabs. Those tabs fit into the slots in the steering knuckles. So when you install the strut, rotate it until the tab falls into the slot. Then you can tighten the pinch bolt. Okay, so are we finally going to install the struts? Yes we are. We're also going to install those reinforcing plates. Installing the plates is really easy. You just set it on top of the strut. Then you install the strut. It's that simple. Just make sure not to get the plates upside down. If you do get it upside down, it will become blatantly obvious when you try to install the strut. One last comment before we install the struts. The BC Racing struts came with upper mounting nuts. I thought that was nice until I compared them to the stock ones. The stock ones are beefier, so I reused them. Anyway, since these coilover struts have camber plates, I had to make sure the plates were oriented properly. The slots on the plates should be oriented left to right. I'm also going to adjust the struts to the softest setting. I can adjust it later if necessary, but for now I just want everything to be consistent. And finally, we need to attach the steering knuckles to the struts. Don't forget the tab on the strut that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, I used a floor jack to lift the hub onto the strut. The steering knuckle is basically flopping around loose, so I had to finagle it back onto the strut. I checked to make sure the strut body was bottomed out in the steering knuckle, then I installed the pinch bolt. Also, don't forget that little bracket that holds the brake line and stuff. And that's it, the struts are done. Time to move on to the next task. Next, I'm going to install the control arm bushings. These are two-piece bushings. The outer part is polyurethane, but the inner part is hard plastic. That plastic piece didn't want to fit onto the control arm. I noticed the control arms had casting seams on them, and figured that was causing the problem. So I used a file to smooth out the casting seams, and that fixed the problem. The plastic pieces were still a little snug, but that's a good thing. You don't want any slop in the control arm bushings. They installed pretty easily with some grease and a rubber mallet. Now we need to address the polyurethane part of the polyurethane bushings. I bought these bushings without the aluminum housings to save some money. So I'm going to reuse the housings from my old bushings. I just need to press the old bushings out. First I tried using my wheel bearing kit, but it wasn't strong enough. So I had to clear some junk out of the way to gain access to the hydraulic press. I was surprised how much force it took to press out those bushings. They really put up a fight. By the way, if you're wearing headphones, there's going to be some loud noises. Now we can press in the new bushings. I put some grease on them to make my life a little easier. Also notice I marked the housing with the letter F for front. These bushings need to go in a certain way and I don't want to get it backwards. The side with the lip around the edge needs to be facing the front of the car. Press in the bushing until that lip just barely touches the mounting bracket. Be careful with this or you'll destroy your new bushing. Now the bushings are ready to install. I put a healthy amount of silicone grease on the centerpiece, then installed the outer piece onto it. And last but not least, we reinstall the bushing onto the chassis. The urethane bushing is significantly stiffer than stock, which makes this step more difficult. I used a big screwdriver to help finagle it into place. Okay, so we have the struts and the control arm bushings installed. We have one last piece to install, and that is the front sway bar. But just like the other parts, the sway bar has side quests that need to be completed before we can finish the main story. One of those side quests involves the sway bar bushings. The original bushings are split down the middle so they can fit over the bar. The new bushings don't have that. I can see a seam in the spot where the stock bushing is cut, but there is no cut. Also, the bushing can't physically fit over the end of the sway bar, so I'm not sure how you're supposed to fit these bushings onto the sway bar. But here's what I did. I cut them along that seam where the stock bushing is cut, but I didn't film it. Normally, the next step would be installing the sway bar, but I bought some reinforcing plates to beef up the mounting points, and they needed to be welded onto the chassis. The new sway bar is pretty beefy, and people say it might pull the sway bar mounting studs out of the chassis. The reinforcing plates are designed to prevent that. To make room to work, I removed the front portion of the wheel well liners and the brake cooling ducts. Next, I test fitted the metal plates and marked around them with a Sharpie. I need to grind off the paint in that area, so I'll have fresh metal to weld to. I did this with my trusty Dremel and a flap wheel. And here's a photo of the plate ready to be welded. I'm not going to weld it all the way around because I don't think that's necessary. But here's something that is necessary. I disconnected the battery so the welder doesn't fry the electrical system in the car. I also used some damp rags to protect the coolant hoses and the wiring. I'm using a flux core welder and it makes a lot of welding spatter. I don't want a stray glob of molten metal burning a hole in one of my coolant hoses. The rags are nice and wet so they won't catch on fire. I don't have a welding blanket because I don't weld often enough to justify the cost. So, yeah. Anyway, let's do some welding. The welding process burned off some of the paint on the frame rail, so I cleaned it up with a wire wheel, and I painted all the bare metal with rubberized undercoating. After it dried, I installed the sway bar. If that sway bar works as good as it looks, I'm going to be a happy camper. I'm also happy because the front suspension is complete, which also means this video is complete. In the next video, we'll start working on the rear suspension. Stay tuned! Hey folks, in the last couple videos I replaced the front suspension in the basket case BMW. Now we're moving on back to the rear suspension. In this video, the crusty old rear suspension is coming out. I took a couple shortcuts to make the job go easier, and I'm going to walk you through it. First of all, notice how the front of the car is up on ramps. We need to have the entire car lifted up because I need access to the exhaust system and the drive shaft. Speaking of the exhaust, that's the first thing we're going to remove. I put my floor jack under the midpoint of the exhaust system. Then I removed all the mounting bolts and used the jack to lower it down. Then I rolled the whole thing out from under the car. Next, we're going to remove the heat shield in the drive shaft tunnel. It's a big piece, but it weighs almost nothing. It's made of thin aluminum sheet. The whole thing is held in place by 4 bolts. We also need to remove a small heat shield next to the differential. It has 2 bolts. Since we're under there, this is a good time to detach the drive shaft from the rear differential. I could only access half of the bolts, so I put the transmission in neutral and turned the drive shaft by hand to get at the other bolts. Then I put it back in park to hold the drive shaft while I remove them. At this point, I decided to remove the rear sway bar. I'm not sure if it was necessary, but I felt like it would give me more room to work. It's pretty straightforward. Each end link has 2 bolts, and each mounting bracket has 1 bolt. Next, I'm going to detach the CV axles from the rear differential. I'm doing that now so I can use the parking brake to hold them while I remove the bolts. And just like the drive shaft, I could only access some of the bolts. So I had to disengage the parking brake, rotate the axles by hand, then reapply the parking brake to hold it in place while I remove the bolts. Next, I'm going to remove the wheel speed sensors. There are 2 ways to go about this. You could leave the sensors installed in the hubs and just unplug them, or you could remove them from the hubs. I decided to do the latter because the electrical plugs are deteriorating and I don't want to touch them. And here in Florida, we don't salt the roads, so I don't have to worry about the sensors getting rusted into the hubs. Ah, look at this gooey black residue inside the wheel well. I wonder where that came from. Anyway, back to work. I don't want to open up the brake hydraulic system, so I'm going to use a shortcut to keep the calipers attached to the brake lines. Here's how that works. First, I need to detach the bottom of the shock absorber from the hub. I put a jack under the hub so nothing crazy happens when the shock is detached. Now I'm going to break loose the bolts that attach the caliper bracket to the hub. I'm doing that now while the hub is still attached to the suspension. If you wait until later, the hub is going to be flopping around. We're not going to remove those bolts yet, just break them loose. While we're in there, we also need to detach the brake line from that mounting bracket. Next, we'll detach the camber arm from the hub. That bolt might need a little persuasion to come out. With the shock absorber and the camber arm detached from the hub, you now have room to remove the brakes. So let's remove those caliper bracket bolts, and we can remove the caliper, the brake pads, and the mounting bracket as a unit. You can finagle the brake line through the space you just made by detaching those suspension components. And now we can set aside the brake caliper. This is also a good time to remove the brake rotor. I also figured this was a good time to remove the suspension springs. At this point, they're basically just sitting loose. Simple enough. Next, we're going to detach the trailing arms from the chassis. Each trailing arm has 3 bolts. This is pretty straightforward. Just keep in mind when you detach it, it's going to fall down. Taking a trailing arm to the face will probably suck. At this point, the suspension is disconnected from the chassis. The subframe is almost ready to come out. But first, we need to detach the parking brake cables. They run through the subframe and up into the cabin to the parking brake lever. You'll have to detach the cables from the parking brake lever, then pull them out. The cables run alongside the drive shafts, so you'll have to get under there and pull the cables out from the chassis. Then you'll have to pull them out of the subframe as well. Here you can see where it goes through the subframe between the upper and lower control arm. You'll have to pull the cable all the way out. Last but not least, we need to remove this aluminum brace in front of the differential. It has 4 small bolts that attach it to the chassis. Those 2 big nuts are actually the fasteners for the front of the subframe. So after you remove this piece, there will be only 2 bolts holding up the subframe. As I was getting ready to drop the subframe, I saw the shocks hanging down and thought they might get in the way, so I decided to remove them. To be honest, I probably could have removed them earlier. Okay, let's drop that subframe. Hey, my plan actually worked. I was able to drop the subframe, the rear differential, and most of the suspension as a unit. Plus I was able to keep the brake hydraulic system sealed up. That's what I call a win-win. Check out these wasp nests. These things are huge. Thankfully there's no wasps in there. There were a bunch of these things all over the car. It makes me wonder if the car sat for a long time before I bought it. Anyway, this is a great opportunity to power wash the undercarriage. It's pretty grungy in there, so I hosed it down with super clean foaming degreaser. I let it soak in for about 10 minutes, then I went after it with the power washer. My electric power washer isn't strong enough to damage hoses or cables unless you really try, but it's powerful enough to remove loose dirt and grime. Now I have easy access to the subframe mounting points, so I can inspect them for damage and install those reinforcing plates. But we'll do that in the next video. Thanks for watching. Hey folks, in the last video I removed the rear suspension from the basket case BMW. In this video we're going to start reinstalling things. But before we do that, we need to install these chassis reinforcement plates from Turner Motorsport. So let's get to work. As some of you may know, the E46 BMWs have a common problem where the chassis starts to crack around the subframe mounting points. This reinforcing kit is designed to help prevent that. The two most common methods to install those plates are welding or bonding them with epoxy. I don't want to be welding next to the gas tank and I don't want to remove it, so I'm going to use the epoxy method. In order for the epoxy to get good adhesion, the chassis where the plates attach needs to be stripped down to the bare metal, and the metal needs to be scuffed up. But before I do that, I'm first going to test fit the reinforcing plates and see how they fit. If any adjustments need to be made, I want to do that now instead of waiting until the plates are covered in epoxy. It's a good thing I did that because, as you can see here, there are some noticeable gaps. So I'm going to use a hammer to gently caress the reinforcing plates until they have a nice snug fit. After the adjustments are complete, I'll trace around the edge with the Sharpie marker. Now I know where to grind off the paint. Speaking of which, I'm going to use an abrasive disc to grind off the paint. Also, there's some rubber undercoating that needs to be removed. I'm going to use a wire wheel for that. By the way, the abrasive disc also did a great job of scuffing up the metal. Prep work is crucial to the performance of an adhesive, so I'm going to use the abrasive disc on the reinforcing plates as well. After I finished with that, I wiped everything down with brake cleaner. Also, I put some grease on the mounting bolts. We're going to use the mounting bolts to hold the reinforcing plates in place while the epoxy cures, and the grease will help keep the epoxy from sticking to the bolts. Okay, now it's time to start mixing up the epoxy. The epoxy I'm using is the JB Weld original formula. I'm sure there will be comments about that. JB Weld has a stigma because of the stupid things people do with it, but the product itself is actually pretty good. If you use it correctly, it can be very effective. And bonding pieces of metal together is one of its intended uses. But if you're still skeptical, Project Farm has a video where he tested several brands of metal bonding epoxies, and the JB Weld original formula performed very well. Anyway, it's important to make sure the entire mating surface is covered with epoxy, and I'm using the mounting bolts to squeeze out any air bubbles or any excess epoxy. Ideally, you should be seeing epoxy squishing out all around the edge. Okay, the plates are installed. The epoxy is going to take 24 hours to cure. In the meantime, we can work on the subframe. Off camera, I cleaned it up with the power washer. It looks pretty good, but there is a little bit of surface rust here and there. So I'm going to grind that off and repaint it. And of course I'm going to replace all the bushings. Speaking of which, it looks like the differential bushings are meant to be installed a certain way. So I need to remember the correct way to install them. Or actually, I don't have to remember, because I have this video footage. For the subframe bushings, I don't need to remember where they go because it's stamped right on them. That's pretty cool. By the way, these bushings are from Garageistic. They're not a sponsor, but so far I'm pretty impressed with their products. By the way, here's a close-up of the rear bushing for the differential. I think it's safe to say it's past its expiration date. Alright, let's get rid of those old bushings. I started out using the wheel bearing kit because it was kind of awkward trying to fit the subframe in the hydraulic press. But after doing one of those bushings by hand, I said screw it and used the hydraulic press anyway. I'll admit I had to do some janky stuff with the hydraulic press. This video clip you're watching is the least janky thing I did. The rest was done off camera to avoid incriminating myself. Anyway, after some head scratching, some swearing, and copious use of safety squints, I got those things pressed out. The next day, the epoxy was cured, so I coated the metal plates with some truck bed liner. I decided to use truck bed liner because, well, I had some. The last can of black Rust-Oleum got used on the subframe, and I didn't feel like making another trip to the hardware store. Believe it or not, this is actually how some project decisions are made. Don't judge. The next day after that, the paint was dry. So it's time to install the new bushings. Most of the new bushings are 2-piece units, which makes them easy to install. I used a big bolt and nut with a couple big washers on it to squeeze the 2 halves of the bushings into the subframe. That actually worked really well. The front differential bushings, however, are 1 piece, but they were easy to install. I literally was able to press them in by hand. Okay, so the subframe is ready, and the chassis is ready. You know what that means, right? It's time to reinstall the subframe. Let's cue up that epic copyright-free music. Okay, that's it for this video. In the next episode, we're going to reinstall the rest of the rear suspension. So stay tuned. Hey folks, previously we removed the rear suspension from the basket case BMW. Then we refreshed the rear subframe and reinstalled it. Now we're going to finish the rest of the rear suspension. Before we start, I want to make a comment. When I removed the rear suspension, I took some shortcuts to make the job go faster. Unfortunately, that came back to haunt me. You'll see why in a moment. Anyway, let's get started. First of all, I want to install the control arms and the camber arms. Let's start with the camber arms. Before installing them, I adjusted them to match the stock ones. To do that, I put a couple long bolts through the stock camber arm and adjusted the new one until it lined up with the bolts. They have these funny looking nuts that need to be inserted into the subframe. When you tighten the bolt, that nut wedges itself in place, so you don't need to hold it with a wrench. That was easy enough. At this point, I decided to install the shock absorbers. To be honest, I'm not sure why I decided to do that at this point, but let's roll with it. On the rear suspension, the shock absorber does not set the ride height, but it does set the maximum droop, which is how far down the suspension can hang. It can also be used to put preload on the springs. I decided to measure the length of the original shocks when fully extended, and subtract an inch because I plan to reduce the ride height about an inch. I can adjust that in the future if necessary. When I went to install the shocks, I had a little problem. My arms weren't long enough to reach into the car and install the mounting nuts while also holding the shock in place. Yeah, I failed at giving my car the reach around. So instead, I had to jack it. What were you thinking? Anyway, let's move on to the upper control arms. They had rubber bushings in them, so I'm going to replace them with polyurethane. But there are a couple things to note. First of all, the control arms are different, so you have to make sure you don't get the right and left side mixed up. I didn't see any markings that signify left and right, so I used a Sharpie marker. Second of all, the bushings are not symmetrical either. The bushing sticks out more on one side than the other, so I made an arrow pointing to the bigger side. Removing those bushings was a pain in the neck. First I tried pressing them out, but that didn't work and I didn't want to damage the control arms. So I had to cut the bushings out. First I drilled out the rubber part with a hole saw. Then I used a hacksaw to cut a slot in the metal sleeve and used a chisel to remove it. The control arm is made of aluminum, so you have to be really careful not to damage it. Okay, now we can install the urethane bushings. Keep in mind where the bigger end needs to go. Once again, the arrow points to the big side. I was able to push in the urethane bushings by hand, but the metal sleeves needed a few love taps with a rubber mallet. I also decided to install the end links into the control arms before putting the control arms in the car. It's easier that way. The end link brackets need to be installed a certain way. That metal tab in the middle needs to be facing the center of the car. Also, the end links for the white line sway bar need to be installed a certain way. One end is smaller than the other. The bigger end goes in the bracket. And here we have the end link installed in the control arm. Once again, that metal tab points to the center of the car. Installing the upper control arm is simple enough. Just line it up with the bolt holes and insert the bolt. This bolt uses a regular nut, so you'll need to counterhold it with a wrench. Next up is the trailing arms. The outer bushings for the control arms are installed in the trailing arm and need to be pressed out. The original bushings were a monoball for the upper control arm and a rubber bushing for the camber arm. I'm going to replace both of them with monoball bushings. Remember what I said about cutting corners to save myself some work? Yeah, that came back to haunt me. You may have noticed the axle, the wheel hub, and the brake rotor shield are still attached to the trailing arm. Trying to press out the bushings is a lot more difficult with all that stuff attached to the trailing arm. I ended up having to remove the parking brake hardware so I could loosen up the brake rotor shields and move them out of the way. But the added weight of the axle and the hub still made the job a lot more difficult. You can learn from my mistakes, so you don't have to repeat them. We're going to skip forward a little bit because I was so busy riding the struggle bus, I forgot to switch on the camera. Anyway, I cleaned up and repainted the trailing arms. I used a Dremel with a flap wheel to clean out the holes for the bearings. I installed the new bushings by hand because trying to hold the trailing arm just right in the hydraulic press, with all the extra weight hanging off it and getting the new bushing pressed in without slipping and damaging something, seemed almost impossible. So I used a long bolt with a coupling nut and a few washers as a makeshift press. My wheel bearing kit didn't have any pressing dies small enough, so I used some old hole saws that I don't care about anymore. At this point, I should probably say, don't try this at home. Next, we're going to install the trailing arm bushings. These are monoball bushings from Moog. They're made for a Toyota Camry, but people say they fit in an E46. Also, there's a guy in the E46 Fanatic forum who sells a kit to make the install easier. The kit includes a flap wheel to clean out the trailing arm, a couple adapter sleeves for the bolt holes, and a pressing die that will perfectly center the bushing in the trailing arm. First, I used the flap wheel to clean out the hole for the bushing. People say the Camry bushings are slightly larger in diameter than the E46 ones. We're talking a fraction of a millimeter. So I used the flap wheel to remount the bushing hole a little bit. Also note that the bushing has a flat side and an angled side. The pressing die goes against the flat side. The angled side gets pressed into the trailing arm. First I tried pressing it by hand using the big bolt and stuff, but that didn't work very well. The bushings didn't want to go in straight, they kept tilting to the side. So I had to use the hydraulic press anyway. I had to be super careful to keep everything lined up properly while trying to hold the trailing arm at an awkward angle with the axle flopping around. It was not fun. But anyway, here's how that pressing die works. You press in the bushing until the outer lip of the pressing die touches the trailing arm. That's it. The bushing is now perfectly centered. Here's another view of that so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, now we need to modify the mounting brackets. The Camry bushings are slightly wider than the E46 ones. It's only about a millimeter or so, but it's enough to prevent the bracket from fitting on the bushing. So I'm going to use a bolt and a couple nuts to spread the sides apart. It doesn't take much. After I was happy with the fit, I put the adapter sleeve in the bushing and installed the bracket. The bolt hole in the Camry bushing is larger than the E46. That adapter sleeve lets you reuse the E46 mounting bolt. Alternatively, you could drill out the bolt holes in the bracket and use bigger bolts. It's up to you. Next, we're going to install the suspension springs. The BC Racing springs have a warning label that says to install the adjuster on top of the spring. So for once, I'm actually going to follow the instructions. But first I noticed the springs didn't fit correctly on the control arms. There was a lot of empty space and the spring was able to move around a lot. I didn't like that. So just out of curiosity, I tried fitting the stock spring pads to see if that would help, and they fit perfectly. Unfortunately, the BC Racing instructions didn't say anything about this. Anyway, installing the springs was simple enough. Same goes for the adjuster. Here's another area where the BC Racing instructions were lacking. They're not very clear about adjusting the ride height or the spring preload. They say the shock body needs to be threaded onto the bottom piece at least 25 millimeters, but they don't say anything about the height adjuster. So I threaded the adjusting collar 25 millimeters onto the adjuster. I can readjust it later if necessary. Okay, we're almost ready to install the trailing arms. But I had to address a couple small issues. First of all, the new camber arms don't use cam bolts to adjust the camber. I imagine you could reuse the bolts, but they can't be used to adjust the camber anymore. That might confuse the alignment tech. So I replaced them with regular bolts. Also, the shock absorber bolts don't have washers because the original shocks have the washer built in. So I bought a couple washers for those bolts. Anyway, let's get those trailing arms installed. Once again, having all that extra stuff attached to the trailing arms made things much more difficult. I had to hold my tongue just right to get that first bolt to line up. But after that, it was all downhill. Also, I had to finagle the brake caliper through the control arms and the axle to get it back into its proper place. And I had to make sure the brake line was routed properly. And after that, it was basically just bolting everything back in. I won't make you sit through all that. And here's the end result. The suspension and brakes are reinstalled, or at least mostly. You may have noticed the rear sway bar and the rear differential are missing. I ran out of time to install those, so we'll have to cover that in the next video. Thanks for watching. Hey folks, in previous videos we refreshed and reinstalled the rear subframe and most of the rear suspension. In this video, we're going to refresh the rear differential and install the new sway bar. This video was delayed because of Hurricane Ian. My workshop was flooded and the car itself was almost flooded as well. But I was eager to get back to work on the BMW so it would be drivable again. Okay, let's start with the rear differential. I bought some new seals and a finned cover plate. I'm also going to replace the differential oil with Mobil 1 synthetic. The first thing I'm going to do is drain out the old differential oil. The differential has a drain port near the bottom and a fill port on the rear cover. Apparently, I didn't notice the drain port, so I drained it through the fill port. Anyway, the oil that came out was almost black, so it was way overdue to be replaced. Since I'm replacing the seals, that means the input and output flanges need to be removed. The input flange uses a 30mm nut with a locking collar thingy. Removing that is simple enough with an impact gun. But the input flange didn't want to come loose, so I used a steering wheel puller. That worked great. I should also mention that I put alignment marks on each piece so I can put them back together exactly how they were before. Now I'm going to remove the input shaft seal. The service manual says you can use a big screwdriver, but I guess my screwdriver wasn't big enough. But if you squint just right, this tire iron looks like a really big screwdriver. And it got the job done. Next, I'm going to remove the output flanges. They're held in the differential with a snap ring. You have to pry on them until it pops loose. I used a small block of wood to give me something to pry against, and a small pry bar to pop it loose. And once again, we're using a really big screwdriver to pry out the seals. Alright, the old seals are out. Now we can install the new ones. I cleaned out the hole and put some fresh differential oil on the seal. The service manual says the output seals should be pressed in until they stop. The new seals went in a little bit further than the old ones. So apparently the original ones weren't pressed in all the way? Hopefully this doesn't cause the seals to leak. Also notice I'm using a block of wood to reinstall the axle stubs. I don't want to hit them directly with the hammer. For the input shaft seal, the manual says to press it in until it's flush with the differential casing. So I was careful not to press it in too far. I stopped several times to check on it. And when I reinstalled the input flange, I also made sure to line up all those alignment marks I made earlier. Next item on the list is the finned cover plate. I bought it used off eBay and it was pretty grungy. It had a thick patina that appeared to be a combination of corrosion and salt residue. There was a lot of that stuff between the cooling fins, so I gave it a thorough cleaning. I went after it with some degreaser and an assortment of different brushes. I had to use pipe cleaning brushes to get between the fins. After the cleaning was finished, I decided to paint it. I'm using silver-colored engine block paint. This stuff is rated for 550 degrees Fahrenheit, so it should have no problem handling the heat from a rear differential. I let the paint dry overnight. Actually, overnight turned into next week, because the next day Hurricane Ian rolled through my neighborhood and made a big mess. So I had to do some hurricane cleanup and deal with some flooding in my workshop. Anyway, let's get this differential cover installed. Of course, we need to remove the old one first. That was simple enough. The bolts are not super tight, so they zip right out. But when I removed the cover, I saw some black residue inside the differential, so I decided to clean it out. I hosed it down with brake cleaner to wash that stuff out. I also took this opportunity to check the inside of the differential. I looked for any signs of abnormal wear on the gears, or any chips or cracks, but everything looks good. According to the service manual, the differential takes about a liter of gear lube. I decided to use Mobil 1 Synthetic 75W90. It meets the GL5 specification. It also has friction modifier for limited slip differentials, although that doesn't matter because this is not a limited slip differential. I decided to pour in the oil now instead of having to pump it in through the fill port later. Okay, we're almost ready to install the new differential cover. However, there is one difference between the finned cover and the plain cover. The finned cover needs a longer bolt for this one bolt hole. The cover that I bought didn't come with any mounting bolts, so I had to buy one. Actually, I ended up buying all new bolts for the differential cover, because the old ones were pretty rusty, and it would look silly to have rusty bolts on a freshly painted differential cover. In case you're wondering, the short bolts are 25mm long, and the longer bolt is 60mm long. Alright, time to install the cover. It originally had a paper gasket, but apparently BMW discontinued the paper gaskets. Now they recommend using RTV sealant instead of a gasket. I figured the black RTV would work. I mean, it works on oil pans and stuff. I was careful not to put too much RTV on there because I didn't want globs of RTV sealant floating around inside the differential. Then I put on all the bolts finger tight and I tightened them just enough to make the sealant start squeezing out. Now the sealant needs to sit for about an hour so it can cure. The RTV has been sitting for about an hour, so it's time to torque those bolts. I couldn't find the torque spec in the service manual, so I searched online and found conflicting results. Go figure. But for a 10mm diameter grade 8.8 bolt, 45 Newton meters seems reasonable, so I went with that. I torqued the bolts in 2 stages, first to 30 Newton meters, then to 45. And as you can see, I torqued the bolts in a crisscross pattern, so the cover was tightened evenly. We're almost ready to install the differential. But before we do that, we need to torque the control arm bolts that go into the subframe, because after the differential is installed, those bolts won't be accessible. Also, a couple of those bushings are rubber, so I need to jack up the suspension before I torque those bolts. Okay, now we can install the differential. Previously, when I did the differential swap from an X3, I used a jack to lift the differential into place. That was kind of a hassle because the differential needed to be tilted upwards first and then it had to be tilted back down, all while sitting on the jack. So I had to play around with wood spacers and stuff. This time I decided to lift it in place by hand. I put an old shirt on the subframe so it won't get scratched up, and I used a furniture dolly to roll the differential under the car. To be honest, it was still kind of a hassle. I had some difficulty getting the bolts to line up, but I think that's because of the urethane bushings. They're not as flexible as rubber, so the bolts need to be lined up perfectly, or they won't fit. And of course, I was trying to do all that while also holding up the rear differential, which is not exactly featherweight. On the plus side, I got a nice workout. With the rear differential in place, I can reattach the drive shaft and the CV axles. I also use the parking brake to hold everything in place while I torque the bolts. And I put a mark on each bolt after torquing it so I wouldn't lose track. I also reinstalled the heat shields off camera. Now we can install the rear sway bar. The end links are already installed in the control arms. I did that in the last video. I figured I would attach the bar to the end links first, then swing the bar up into place. But when I tried that, there wasn't enough room to install the brackets for the center bushings. So I had to take it all back apart and do the center bushings first. If you remember, when I installed the front sway bar, the center bushings didn't have the split cut in them, so I had to cut it myself. But on the rear sway bar, the bushings do have the split, so that's nice. Anyway, I finally got the sway bar installed, and off camera I also reinstalled the exhaust and stuff. At that point it was getting late and I was getting pretty tired, so I called it a night. Okay, so everything is installed. I just need to make some adjustments to the rear suspension. I put marks on the adjusting collars on the springs and on the shock absorber bodies. That makes it easier to keep track of things. I guesstimated the ride height before I installed everything, and my guess was way off. The ride height was actually higher than stock, so I had to use trial and error to get the ride height where I wanted it. Adjusting the rear suspension is kind of a pain because the spring and the shock are separate. So for example, when I shortened the ride height adjuster on the spring, that created slack in the spring. And I don't want the springs to fall out, so that meant I had to shorten the shocks to take up the slack. Then I had to put the wheels back on, put the car back on the ground to check the ride height, and so on. But eventually I got the ride height where I wanted it. With the old suspension, the ride heights were all over the place, partly because of the worn-out suspension parts and partly because of the deformed strut towers. But with the new suspension, the front ride height is about 13.5 inches on both sides, and the rear is about 13.75 on both sides. No more crazy mismatched ride heights. Alright, the rear suspension is finished. This also finishes the entire suspension project, and it finishes this video.